Hello, I'm Casey Aiken, and this is 21 This Week. Coming up next, County Executive calls for vaccine passports, even though COVID-19 hospitalization rate remains below 10%. Chaotic MCPS quarantine program being criticized, and remembering the 9/11 anniversary. Our panel of insiders will give you the story behind the story. We're joined by former County Council member and founder of SkillSmart, a technology startup working to build stronger communities, Mike Knapp, and Secretary of the Maryland Republican Central Committee, Marc Uncapher. Stay tuned for these stories and more on the next 21 This Week. Welcome back from our summer sabbatical to 21 This Week, Montgomery County's hardest-hitting political talk show. When we departed at the end of July, the threat of the Delta variant was being felt regionally. Since then, there's been a substantial increase in the number of COVID-19 transmissions, reaching a peak of 100 cases per 100,000 residents on September 3rd. It was about this time that Montgomery County Executive Marc Elrich announced that the county should consider a vaccine passport program. Mr. Elrich was not specific on how such a program would be administered or whether the county council would even support such a program. Mike, since Mr. Elrich's proposal of a vaccine passport last week, the daily infection rate for COVID-19 has been gradually declining, and today the transmission rate is about where it was in mid-April. In addition, the overall hospitalization rate never exceeded 10%. So are we likely to see a vaccine passport program being implemented?
I don't think we are. The part that really intrigued me when I first heard the county executive raise this was as a regional issue, to try and work with the other jurisdictions to have a passport that would be used throughout the region so people could see it, since we still have so much mobility in the region. And then I didn't hear any of those other leaders in the counties and jurisdictions around us say anything about that. It kind of, if a tree falls in the forest, anybody there to hear it, did it really make a noise? And this one didn't make any noise that I could tell. And so I think that in the absence of any response there, he picked that up and said we should do one here. I could make an argument or have somebody make an argument for looking at something regionally because of that mobility, but to do something in Montgomery County where we already have such a high vaccination rate and we really don't see a significant amount of transmission, not that what we've seen isn't alarming, but we have started to see that subside. I don't think you're going to see anything, and I don't see that there would be a whole lot of value in doing it.
Well, I must say that I heard a great deal of pushback from some restaurant owners that I'm friends with and I have as clients. They were furious about the suggestion because they felt that it would further decrease the number of people who'd be willing to go out, and people would retreat back into their houses again. So I did hear from the business community that there would be a pushback. There might be a pushback on that.
I don't know if people retreat back into their houses. I think they'll just go. They'll do things different. It's just one more step, right? One more barrier. And so I think those people who have gotten vaccinated, most people I know have managed to hang on to their cards and are happy to show you if they have it. And quite honestly, in Montgomery County, most places I've gone, people are pretty mindful of it and are wearing masks if they have concerns. But with such a high vaccination rate, I haven't seen it as a big issue. So I don't know that people retreat. I just think it becomes one more barrier to entry and people will find another way to go out and do things and they'll just take the precautions that they're already taking, which is why I just don't think
again, I think we're we have this juxtaposition that our region, our Virginia, DC, other jurisdictions are not implementing it. And you're going to find yourself back in a position where people will go to Virginia, people go to other jurisdictions. Yeah. I find it offensive personally, the idea of having a vaccine passport, but that's my personal belief. I want to go to Marc on this. As the Delta variant has begun to wane, there's a new strain, the variant, the mu or the mutant strain, which has been discovered. So are we at a point where we just have to learn to live with COVID-19, its progeny, its mutations, its variants, and we just have to deal with it?
Well, I sure hope we don't have to go through the entire Greek alphabet to Zeta, because we could be doing this for quite some time. Let me just say, I agree with Mike completely about the regional piece, but I would say, I would kind of add to that, I've managed, I mean, I was vaccinated long ago, like 6, 7 months ago. I have yet to have to show my card to anybody. I've gone, I've flown a couple of times and been elsewhere around the country. I think the honor system seems to work well. I mean, I recognize that there is a minority of people who haven't been vaccinated, but among the most at risk, at least in Montgomery County, the rate is very high. I'm really not quite sure what having those additional precautions of having to check and verify really adds to that. We'll see. It's hard to predict just how long this is all going to last.
Well, I mean, let's be realistic here. 20% of our population hasn't been vaccinated, and they are resistant to being vaccinated. So, I mean, are we going to say to those people that they are the target? I mean, I have a real problem with the civil liberty aspect of having this passport being shown and being enforced by retailers. I just have a big
Well, you put your
disagreement with this. I was in.
Businesses don't want to be in the position of having to do that kind of screening.
Well, and I think that's the challenging thing, right? If I'm a retail operator, it's hard enough to run my organization and make that work in a meaningful way. And now I've got to figure out how to post people at the door to check this passport. And I just think it becomes just one more obstacle to them being successful. And that's the part I struggle with as a small business owner, that you're going to sit there and try and check everybody coming in. You just don't have the capacity to do it and run your business.
Well, I mean, I was shocked. I was away when Mr. Elrich made the proposal. I was actually in Michigan, the land of wretched Gretchen Whitmer, and there was no discussion or consideration even there that vaccine passports. So it was quite shocking when I learned of this upon my return to Montgomery County. So, but I guess if things get seriously bad again, I suppose these proposals will go back into effect. We didn't have time to talk about Dr. Gale's departure, but maybe we will in our next segment. Montgomery, which deals with Montgomery County Public Schools, which are now back in session for in-person learning, but they're still requiring students to wear a mask while on school grounds and buses. Students who prefer not to attend in person have the opportunity to attend a virtual academy if they are admitted to such. Mark, since most students are too young to be vaccinated at this stage, I mean, I think we're only down to about 14-year-olds who are eligible for being vaccinated. MCPS is requiring unvaccinated students to quarantine if they come into contact with a person who has COVID symptoms. A very nebulous standard,
Right.
and that is being criticized and giving some pushback by parents who find this unmanageable.
And I think you put your finger on the key point. Is the standard is a little is not little. It's very vague as to what it is. It probably would be far clearer if it was the standard was a member of the household or something like that. But it's tough too, because remember what we know about kids of that age. They're likely to be asymptomatic if they get COVID, and they're also not likely to get COVID. So there's a reason why they're not being vaccinated, because their prospects of being a spreader are fairly low.
Well, I mean, I guess the administration of this is, I feel for the school system, because trying to keep everyone safe at the same time,
Right.
trying to educate has obviously been a big concern. And so I guess that gets to the fundamental question, Mike, and every jurisdiction approaches this a little differently, but whether or not mask mandates are effective in preventing the spread of COVID-19 to students.
I think from what I've seen, obviously I'm not an expert, but from what I've seen, that yes, it does reduce the spread. Now, it continues to be a political discussion. I know there's an article in the Post earlier this week where talked about it. What a school now, the Alexandria decisions that to have a mask mandate that went through unanimously, and contrasted that to the township in Pennsylvania where to not have a mask mandate went through unanimously. And so we have these extremes. I think that you are seeing situations where a mask mandate does slow down the spread. Where there's a school system in Texas where they had 2 teachers dead in the first 4 days because there was no mask mandate. That's not dispositive, but you're seeing, but clearly they got them. They got it from somebody, and so I mean the challenge becomes how do you address that? And I think in this community, people are more comfortable with the mask mandate. I think kids and students at this point are comfortable, are fine wearing it. You're always going to find some that don't want to, but most kids I've spoken to are like, it is what it is right now. And so they seem to be flexible and have adapted for the most part.
Well, but we're seeing our sports programs, particularly football, where students are not wearing masks while they're exercising, and they're breathing heavily on one another when they're in a scrum. It seems that on one hand we're advocating the use of masks. On the other hand, we recognize the limitation of.
I don't really recognize the limitation. I think people are aspirational and hopeful that we can go back to the normalcy that we once had, and so we're going to try to do this over here and recognize we can't do it other places because we hope for the best. I mean, honestly, I think people want to get back to normalcy. We're struggling with it. And yet we're not there yet. And so we continue to kind of walk this bizarre contrast. I mean, one of the craziest things was watching college football last weekend, and you got 85,000 people in stands. We're all going to pretend there's not an issue. And, it's just.
Well, Mike, I'll take exception with that. They're not pretending that there's not an issue. They're addressing it differently. They're willing to take a risk. It's not that they
they're willing to expose people to they're willing to expose others. Right. They're willing to make sure others bear that risk as well. And I think that's the part I struggle with.
Look, I mean, I know I'm not a scientist, I'm not a doctor, but I read the statistics, and it looks to me that the mortality rate from COVID-19 is about the same as the seasonal flu.
No, it's not. No, it's not. Those numbers don't bear that out at all, Casey.
What are the numbers then? Are they 3 times, 4 times higher in terms of transmission and terms of fatality?
The mortality and fatality is significantly higher. I have to go back and look now, but it was never even close to the seasonal flu.
I'll research that.
I do think it's more severe. I mean, one of the challenges we have is when we overlay a variety of other factors, such as being vaccinated, and we adjust by age and take out high-risk populations. You end up getting kind of a disease that is sort of less destructive than, say, it was in a place like New York in the very early days, when we really didn't have the tools and where the healthcare system was effectively overwhelmed. And that's, I think, been one of those challenges, is this fact that it's kind of hard to isolate the specific circumstance at a particular point in time to make an evaluation.
Well, and I think the point that you asked at the last question, Casey, is are we going to have to live with this? And I think the answer is yes. And I think with each passing week, day, month, year, we're getting better at it. And so to your point, Mark, we're going to have better medications. We're going to have vaccines. We know how to treat it better when it appears. We know what we're looking for. And so all of those things are going to come in, and ultimately we'll be at a point, and I don't know when ultimately is that 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, where it will be a part of what our normal life, and we'll have to figure out, and we'll have figured out a way to address it and manage it.
Yeah, I want to comment on the management of it. I'm really surprised and disappointed that we are almost 2 years into this process, and the federal government hasn't released a process for how to treat COVID-19 patients. What are the appropriate drugs and medicines that should be used in the treatment of COVID-19. We had the intermetricin or vetricin, issue come up last week. And I'm just surprised that we don't have a treatment system already in place after almost 2 years of dealing with this thing.
I think it shows the evolution of this and the evolution of biology. And so each time we think we have a handle on it, you see a variation, you get a mutant, and so we're on to a different strain. But I think conceptually people are getting better at it. I think individual hospitals are getting better at it. I think the health system's getting at it and it's learning how to address it. And we'll get better. We'll continue to improve.
All right, we'll get your booster shots. And when we come back from this short break, we're going to talk about remembering the 9/11 attack on its 20th anniversary. Stay tuned. Welcome back. The annual remembrance of the terrorist attack, which occurred on September 11th, 2001, is always a difficult time for me personally, and I know it is for many in this region. One very close friend, Michelle Heidenberger, was killed when American Airlines Flight 77 was flown into the Pentagon. And I was acquaintances with 2 others that were also on that flight. This year, because of the controversy over the retreat from Afghanistan, those memories are particularly painful. Mike, how are Americans in general supposed to think about what happened 20 years ago and try to put it in the context of current events?
It's a difficult question. I have similar remembrances. I have a cousin who passed away in the World Trade Center, and so it's always a difficult time for our family as well. But it's I think 20 years ago it showed a vulnerability into the U.S. that we didn't realize happened. That was there. That we never expected that there could be an attack on American soil, rightly or wrongly. And I think over the course of the last 20 years and the evolution of international affairs and the changing world dynamics and I think with the pullout of Afghanistan over the course of the past few weeks, but even just how that war has been administered and what we've seen successes and where we haven't, show that vulnerability is real and continues to exist, and that the role that perhaps we thought, rightly or wrongly, that the U.S. played in the world isn't exactly what many of us thought it was. And so the challenge is how do we address that vulnerability? How do we recognize that vulnerability? And then how do we begin to address it? And I think that's the challenge. And so I think that's the challenge we all have is to address that vulnerability and then figure out individually and collectively to move forward from it.
Mark, I'm going to ask you the same question, which is, how do we put this into context? There's, 20 years have passed. There was, as Mike pointed out, we recognize that there was external threats that existed, and we tried to take action against them. But are we retreating from that perseverance now, given the way that Afghanistan was handled in the evacuations?
Well, the comparison that strikes me is the sort of unity, how we as a country came together, and some of the divides, the boundaries, the divisions, the schisms that existed really we recognized it as being just nowhere near as important as what we shared together as a common people. And people shared that view around the world as well. And there was a unity that came of that. And certainly it's not something we have right now. We don't certainly even have it with COVID. I mean, that we were arguing, and we really have a lot of division. And I think that's a shame and it's a tragedy, and it's also kind of a reminder of how when we get divided like that, as we are now, how debilitating it can be when we feel as though we have to question the leadership, the credibility of leaders in various positions, and not feel comfortable with the answers they're giving and the direction that they're suggesting.
Well, I mean, I know that there are those who feel there's a great sense of betrayal of returning power to the Taliban, who fostered the ability for the 9/11 attacks to be launched against our country. I mean, I can understand that feeling.
Well, my son served 2 tours in Afghanistan, and his observation is the area that he served in has been back under Taliban rule for the last 5 or 6 years. So this has not been, this happened very suddenly, but it has also been a slow motion process for quite some time.
And I think it's interesting too that you make that point, Casey. And there are a lot of folks who want to say that the withdrawal was the thing. Well, the reality is that the previous administration had negotiations with the Taliban, which provided them legitimacy. This has been an interesting scenario because we've had presidents from both parties engaged in this entire process, and at the end of the day, no matter which side we were on, we never managed to advance the ball particularly far down the field. And so I think to Mark's point on the collective nature of where we need to be, how do we come together, I think we should look at that and say, okay, where are we and where do we want to be, as opposed to kind of looking back and going, wow, they screwed up or they screwed up. Clearly, we as a country did not achieve the outcome that we desired, and we had both parties participating in leadership at different times in that process, and nobody advanced the ball particularly far.
Well, I'm not disagreeing with you, Mike. I mean, frankly, I'm critical of the Trump administration for engaging in those negotiations as well. My own personal view, but I mean, I think you have to acknowledge that it was an intractable situation that needed some resolution at some point, and it's hard to come to grips with the fact that the same group that were in control of Afghanistan when the 9/11 attacks were launched are now back in control. For me personally, that's it. We're getting the wrap sign, so we're going to go on to parting shots when we come back from this short break. Welcome back. Now with parting shots, Mike Knapp.
Thanks, Casey. As we remember 9/11 20 years ago, Mark raised a point earlier. I think it's really important for us to remember that was a time that really, as tragic as it was, brought our country and the world together to figure out how to come together, to recognize, to mourn, to recognize the tragedy that was there, and then also to chart a path forward. And we've seen such fractiousness over the last 4 to 6 years. I think it's just so important that we should take a moment this weekend to reflect upon that and think about how much stronger we are together than when we are divided. And so hopefully that's my parting shot for today.
Thank you, Mike. Good sentiments. Mark Uncapher, your parting shot.
I was going to agree with Mike on that point, but elaborate a little bit. And I think one of the great challenges is the breakdown in trust that Americans have about so many of their institutions, expert institutions, be it most recently the military, whether it's public health officials, media, I could go down the entire list. And it is a regrettable phenomenon, but one that is great cost. As we try and encourage people to get vaccinated, we're dealing with this gap of faith that folks have in institutions. And as a society, we really need to strive to get that restored.
Well, Mark, thank you. And Mike, thank you. I mean, it's a very tough topic to talk about the 9/11 remembrances. It's particularly hard for me, as I said. I'm a little bitter still about the loss of my life of my friends. But I know that there was a time when our country was unified in spirit, and I hope we can achieve that again in the near future. I want to thank you all for being here. I want to thank the audience for tuning in each and every week to Montgomery County's hardest hitting political talk show. I promise next week I'll find my tie. For 21 this week, I'm Casey Aiken.